Brian Mitchell thought he had found the perfect home until the HOA blindsided him with a fraudulent $12,000 fee for road repairs that never happened. At the heart of it all was George Sanders, the corrupt HOA president, who had spent years extorting homeowners and funneling their money into his own pockets. But when Brian refused to back down, he uncovered a massive financial scheme and led a legal battle that shook the entire community. And just wait until you hear how justice was served, right in the middle of the courtroom. Brian Mitchell had always dreamed of owning a home where he could finally breathe easy, a place where he wouldn't have to deal with noisy upstairs neighbors, outrageous rent increases, or the constant grind of city life. So when he found a charming 3-bedroom house in a quiet Florida suburb, tucked away on a peaceful cul-de-sac, it felt like a fresh start. Everything about the neighborhood seemed perfect. The tree-lined streets, the neatly trimmed lawns, the friendly nods from neighbors as they walked their dogs. It was exactly what he had pictured when he imagined settling down. He could already see himself spending slow mornings, drinking coffee on his porch, weekend barbecues in the backyard, and lazy Sunday afternoons with nothing but the sound of cicadas humming in the background. For the first few months, that dream remained intact. Life in the neighborhood was as peaceful as he had hoped. No unexpected issues, no major headaches, just the simple joy of coming home to a quiet, welcoming community. Until the letter arrived. It was a thick envelope stuffed into his mailbox, along with the usual stack of junk mail and bills. Brian barely glanced at it at first, assuming it was just some standard notice, maybe a local newsletter or an advertisement for lawn care services. But when he tore it open and unfolded the crisp white pages, his eyes immediately locked onto a number that made his stomach drop. $12,000. His brain stalled for a second, trying to process what he was seeing. $12,000 for what? His pulse picked up as he skimmed the letter, his grip on the paper tightening. It was an official notice from the Homeowners Association, HOA, informing him that he was responsible for paying a mandatory assessment fee for the urgent and necessary reconstruction of the neighborhood's main road. The deadline? 30 days. Brian blinked. He glanced outside, looking at the road in front of his house, as if expecting to see a disaster zone, a street full of massive potholes, cracked pavement, something that could possibly justify such an outrageous fee. But the road was perfectly fine, not a single visible crack, not a single patch of wear and tear. In fact, it looked better than some of the roads in town that actually needed fixing. He had driven on it every day since moving in and never once noticed an issue. His jaw tightened as he reread the letter, searching for some kind of explanation. But the more he read, the less sense it made. Why was he being charged for repairs that didn't even seem necessary? And then the real kicker hit him. Brian hadn't even signed up for the HOA. When he bought the house, one of the biggest selling points was that this street wasn't part of the HOA's jurisdiction. The previous owner had made that very clear. No mandatory membership, no yearly dues, no ridiculous rules about mailbox colors or lawn decorations. So how the hell were they demanding money from him? He grabbed his phone and started searching through his closing documents, flipping through paperwork until he found what he was looking for, proof that his property wasn't legally bound to the HOA. His house wasn't part of their original development plan, which meant their authority shouldn't extend to him. And yet, here he was, staring at a bill demanding thousands of dollars for something he had zero obligation to pay. A slow, uneasy feeling settled in his chest. This wasn't just a simple mistake. Something was very, very wrong. And he had a feeling this was just the beginning. Brian wasn't the kind of guy to roll over and accept something that didn't make sense. If something smelled off, he was going to find out why. And this whole situation? It reeked. So he did what any reasonable person would do. He started asking questions. First, he went door to door talking to his neighbors. Most of them had already received the same letter. Some were confused, some were annoyed, but a few were just exhausted. That's when he met Karen, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her late 50s. Karen had been living in the neighborhood for over a decade. The moment Brian brought up the HOA fees, her face twisted in frustration. "You seriously think we need to pay for this?" she scoffed, shaking her head. "They pulled this exact same stunt 2 years ago, claimed the roads were falling apart, forced everyone to pay up, and guess what? Not a single repair was ever made." Brian felt his chest tighten. That didn't sound like an accident. That sounded like a scam. Then Tom, a retired electrician who had been in the neighborhood even longer, chimed in. They do this every time, he said, leaning against his porch railing. Some emergency project pops up. They tell us it's urgent. We cough up the money, and then nothing. No work crews, no construction, no improvements. But the HOA board? Oh, they always seem to be doing just fine. Brian felt a slow burn rising in his stomach. Wait, are you saying they've been collecting money for repairs that never even happened? Tom let out a dry laugh. Oh, kid, you're catching on fast. Brian took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the HOA letter still clutched in his hand. If this was true, then this wasn't just mismanagement. This was straight-up theft. Digging deeper. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Brian started digging through records, talking to more homeowners, and tracing the money. What he found made his blood boil. The HOA board members were funneling money into their own contracting business. Every time they declared a necessary repair, they hired the same mystery company to do the job. A company that, on paper, looked legit, until Brian found out that the CEO was none other than George Sanders, the HOA president himself. It was a closed loop of corruption. 1. Declare a fake emergency project. 2. Charge homeowners thousands of dollars. 3. Award the contract to their own company. 4. Pocket the cash and never actually do the work. It wasn't just unethical, it was fraud. Brian had the receipts, bank records, past complaints, even an old article from 5 years ago where another homeowner had tried to expose them before mysteriously moving away. It was undeniable. The entire HOA was a racket, built on siphoning money out of the community while threatening anyone who dared to challenge them. And now, Brian was their next target. The retaliation begins. When he refused to pay the fraudulent fee, the HOA struck back, hard. First, they hit him with a non-compliance violation for his front lawn. The letter claimed his grass was overgrown and that he'd be fined $100 a day until it was fixed. Except his lawn was perfect, trimmed neat, even better kept than most of his neighbors. Then the threats escalated. More fines, more violations. They accused him of having an unauthorized mailbox, even though it was the exact same style as everyone else's. They claimed his driveway had excessive cracks. It didn't. Every week, a new letter, a new penalty. Then came the legal threats. One day, a formal notice landed in his mailbox. Failure to comply with HOA regulations could result in legal action, up to and including foreclosure. Brian's stomach twisted. Foreclosure? They were threatening to take his home, his damn home, because he refused to be scammed? And then the worst blow. One evening, he came home to find a notice taped to his door, effective immediately. HOA reserves the right to suspend community privileges, including water and power, for non-compliant residents. They weren't just trying to fine him into submission. They were trying to starve him out. That was it. Brian wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to burn them to the ground. Brian had reached his limit. At first, he tried to be reasonable. Maybe there had been a mistake. Maybe some paperwork got mixed up, and a quick conversation would clear things up. But after weeks of bogus fines, legal threats, and outright harassment, it became painfully clear. This wasn't incompetence. This was a racket. And if the HOA thought they could bully him into silence, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Brian wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to bring them down. Taking the fight to court. The first thing he did was hire an attorney, and not just any attorney. He found Mark Lawson, a specialist in HOA fraud cases, a ruthless, no-nonsense lawyer who had spent years dismantling corrupt neighborhood boards, just like this one. When Brian laid out the evidence, the fake repair projects, the illegal fees, the harassment, and the financial inconsistencies, Lawson didn't hesitate. He looked up from the documents, his expression dark. "This isn't just civil fraud," he said. "This is criminal." That same week, they filed a class action lawsuit against the HOA. The charges? Fraudulent fees. Financial mismanagement, breach of fiduciary duty. Harassment and illegal foreclosure threats. But Brian didn't stop there. He rallied the community. He went door to door, exposing everything he had uncovered. The response was explosive. For years, homeowners had been quietly grumbling about the HOA's ridiculous fees, but they had always paid up out of fear. They didn't have proof. They didn't have the time or energy to fight back. But now, they had Brian. They had a case, and they were pissed, exposing the scam. The first step was to demand full financial disclosure. Florida law requires HOAs to keep detailed and transparent financial records, and any homeowner has the right to request them. So Brian and his lawyer formally demanded to see the books. The HOA stalled. At first, they claimed the records were incomplete, then they were misplaced, then they outright refused to hand them over. Big mistake. A court order forced them to release the documents, and when they did, the truth spilled out like a dam breaking. The numbers didn't add up. Tens of thousands of dollars in road repairs had been collected over the years, yet not a single legitimate invoice existed. No real contractors, no actual work orders, just a paper trail of money disappearing into a black hole. Except it wasn't a black hole. It was George Sanders. Brian's digging had uncovered the final piece of the puzzle. George Sanders, the HOA president, personally owned the contracting company that had supposedly been hired for all these urgent repairs. Every time a new emergency popped up, the HOA collected money from residents, handed the contract to Sanders' company, and then nothing. No actual repairs, just money funneled into Sanders' pockets. Worse, Sanders and his fellow board members had been forging documents to cover their tracks, falsifying receipts, doctoring financial statements, and moving money between multiple fake accounts. It was organized fraud on a massive scale. When this information became public, the neighborhood erupted. People who had been paying these fraudulent fees for years were furious. Many had struggled financially just to keep up with HOA payments, believing they were contributing to real community improvements. Now, they knew the truth. Residents stormed HOA meetings, demanding resignations, refunds, and criminal charges. Local news outlets caught wind of the story, and suddenly reporters were knocking on HOA board members' doors. The pressure was mounting. And Brian was just getting started. For months, the case against the HOA dragged on. Lawyers combed through financial records, forensic accountants traced missing funds, and former board members were grilled in depositions. Every new piece of evidence painted the same damning picture, an HOA that had turned into a personal money-printing machine for a handful of corrupt officials. The trial became a local sensation. News crews camped outside the courthouse. Journalists wrote scathing exposés. Homeowners who had suffered under the HOA's rule for years packed the gallery, waiting for justice. And then, it finally happened. The judge didn't waste words. This HOA engaged in widespread fraud, financial mismanagement, and harassment of its residents. The evidence presented is overwhelming. In one swift motion, the entire board was dissolved. Their bank accounts frozen. Every homeowner who had been forced to pay into the scam reimbursed. Brian felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was fighting an uphill battle alone. He had won, and not just for himself, for every person in that neighborhood who had been scammed, bullied, and extorted. But the best moment? That came next. As the judge continued reading the verdict, a bailiff moved toward the defense table where George Sanders sat, pale and sweating. The moment the words criminal fraud and embezzlement left the judge's mouth, the handcuffs clicked shut around Sanders' wrists. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Brian watched as the man who had spent years robbing his own neighbors, who had threatened, fined, and bullied anyone who dared to question him, was led away like any common thief. He wasn't the king of the HOA anymore. Now, he was just another fraudster facing real prison time. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of homeowners gathered, waiting for updates. When Brian stepped out onto the steps, he was met with cheers and applause. People shook his hand, patted him on the back, and thanked him for standing up when no one else had. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was finally free. As he turned to leave, a voice from behind made him pause. One of the former HOA board members, one of Sanders' cronies, glared at him, seething. "You destroyed the whole system." Brian didn't even break stride. He just chuckled, glancing over his shoulder. "You destroyed yourselves," he said. "I just took out the trash."